Welcome. My name is Yael Shimoni, and I teach in Yeshivat Risha in Israel. Every week, Yeshivat Risha does a very special project with Hadran. Hadran, the house for women, the bite for women who want to learn Daf Yomi. And every week, we choose one Rashi and Tosfot to discuss together and learn a little bit more in depth while we're learning Daf Yomi, because Daf Yomi is very fast, and a lot of time it's hard to take something into yourself more slowly. So to take just 20 minutes one week, every week, and hear a little shir about Rashi and Tosfot helps us grasp more from our learning of the Daf Yomi. We call this shir Gefet, Gimel for Gemara, Pei for Perush Rashi, and Taf for Tosfot. So welcome to Gefet, and to all of you who haven't heard us before in Hebrew, this is the first broadcast in English. So let's begin. Today we are learning the first Gefet for Masechet Sukkah. We're learning Daf Yud Rashi and Tosfot Dibur Matchil Peres. What are we going to discuss? Rashi and Tosfot are going to deal with a very interesting question. What is considered something aesthetic? What's noi? What is noi sukkah? So we will learn Rashi and Tosfot, but we will also discuss the philosophical aspects of aesthetics that arise from this sugya. So let's begin. We start with the Mishnah. The Mishnah states the following: "Peres alea sadin mipnei hachama o tachtea mipnei hanesher, או שפרס על גבי הכינוף פסולה, אבל פורס הוא על גבי נקליטי המיטה." The Mishnah says, if you take a piece of clothing, of cloth, and you put it above the sukkah because it's very hot, or you put it below the schach of the sukkah because you don't want the schach to fall into your soup, that's a problem. The sukkah is pasul. And when we think about this, it makes perfect sense. Why? Because we've all learned, and we know it from Sukkah every year, that you're supposed to have a schach that's made of very specific things. You're not supposed to have a piece of cloth over your head. You're supposed to have a schach over your head. And Rashi says exactly that. Rashi says, what's the problem? Sadin davar mekabel tum'au upasul l'schach. Rashi says the problem with clothing is that clothing might be made out of things that are natural, and maybe we would have thought that it's good for schach, but that's not true, because it's not only being natural what makes you a good schach. You have to be something that is natural in the sense that no person turned it into a kli. It did not become something that humans have changed. It has to be something natural. So a piece of cloth can be made out of nature, but it already turned into a kli, and kli mekabel tum'ah, and that cannot be a schach. The Gemara continues and says, 1 minute. The Mishnah said something very, very, very dramatic. Okay, you cannot use a cloth to be a schach. That's okay, but that's not what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah said that if you have a kosher schach, you cannot add also the cloth, because the cloth will be posel the schach, which is kosher. Is that really the case? Comes Rav Chisda and says a very important memra. Says Rav Chisda, lo shanu ela mipnei hanesher, aval lenaota kshera. Says Rav Chisda, the Mishnah is speaking about a cloth below the schach, and that is a problem, but not always. If the reason that you put this piece of cloth below the schach is to make the sukkah more beautiful, that's fine. That's kasher lemehadrin. The only problem is what the Mishnah said. Okay, so first of all, let's talk a bit of aesthetics. Why would I want to put a piece of clothing below my schach? So I can give you a few good reasons. Any of you who deal with creating your houses more beautiful, or if you paint inside a house, so the way that the roof looks makes a big difference of how you feel inside the space. So I might want to take a white cloth and put it on top, so the sukkah will look brighter and will feel bigger, because if my schach is very, very dark, I might feel, crushed inside my sukkah. So that's one good reason. Another good reason is if I have a very beautiful cloth and I want to have a more beautiful ceiling, so I have a schach kasher, I just want to have something extra below. Says Rav Chisda, that's great. Yeah, go with all these ideas. That's kasher. The only problem is if you put this piece of cloth because you want to protect the sukkah from the nesher. Asks the Gemara, Pshita, Rav Chisda, why did you tell me this? The Mishnah really said only nesher. Of course, the Mishnah thinks that there's no problem to put cloth in order to beautify the sukkah. Pshita, mipnei nesher tanan. Continues to the Gemara and says, no, this is not pshita. Why? Ma'u detema, hu adin afilu l'nauta. V'hadekatani mipnei nesher o chadamim kakatani kamash malan. Says the Gemara, if Rav Chisda would not have spoken, I would have thought that putting a piece of cloth below the schach is always problematic. Also, if I try to make the sukkah more beautiful, if I'm trying to beautify it. That's how I would have read the Mishnah. I would have read any cloth is problematic. Why? Because I would have thought that also aesthetics might cause a problem with the schach. So that's why Rav Chisda had to come and say, no, yeah, it's not an example. That's the idea. Only if it's there to protect you from leaves falling on you. But if you want to beautify the sukkah, everything is great. Rashi gives us a very important statement here. Rashi says, Aval lenaota en shem schach alea vekshera. Says Rashi, when something is there for aesthetics, that's not schach. So that's why this piece of clothing is fine. Rav Chisda and Rashi are really problematic to understand. I'll ask this way. What's the aesthetic difference between beautifying the sukkah and protecting the sukkah from becoming full of leaves because of the schach? That's also beautifying. This is beautifying. This is beautifying. So why beautifying to change the color or the atmosphere? That's kasher. And beautifying in order to keep it from being disgusting, that's pasul. But that's what Rav Chisda says according to Rashi. And that's a problem in Shitat Rashi. Before we deal with this problem, we'll continue to the following in the Gemara, because there's a very beautiful part that I must dwell with you on. I don't want to go fast. That's what we do in Daf Yomi. I want to really stay just for 30 seconds, okay? The Gemara says, well, Rav Chisda said a Meimah. Maybe it's not Rav Chisda's idea. Maybe it's already written in the Mishnah where Lema Messiah Lei, and the Gemara brings a very famous Baraita, which is a beautiful Baraita, and I love this Baraita. So let's read it, and I'll explain why I find this Baraita so exciting. It says the Baraita this: Sichecha kehilchata ve'itra bekreminu בסדינים המצוירים ותלה בה אגוזים, שקדים, אפרסקים, רימונים, פרחילי ענבים, עטרות של שיבולים, ינות, שמנים וסלטות. אסור להסתפק מהם עד מוצאי יום טוב האחרון של חג, ואם התנה עליהם הכל לפי תנאו. A Baraita is a Mishnah that did not is something that was written by the Tanaim, which did not become part of the Mishnah, but it's still considered something as strong as the Mishnah because Tanaim wrote it. And what the Tanaim do here is they describe, and that's why I love this Baraita, they describe how the sukkahs in their time looked. It looks as if once then people did a very good job with their sukkahs because they were putting all kinds of beautiful things inside. They put in, first they did a good schach, right? Then they added all kinds of cloths, kremim, sdinim metzuyarim. And Rashi explains to us what's all this fabric doing here. There are different kinds of fabrics. So Rashi says, kremim metzuyarim maase oreg, bigdei tziv'onim, badim meutarim betzvayim v'tzurot. They had special, they dressed up the sukkah. They put special cloths with all kinds of pictures on them, or embroidery. Sdinim ha-metzuyarim, says Rashi, some of the sdinim, the embroidery was ma'aser okem. You could really feel it with your hands. These are the beautiful things they had in their sukkot. And continues the Baraita and says they had a lot of food in the sukkah. Talaba egozim, shkedim, afarsekim. All this is fruits, not vegetables, fruits, rimon, afarsek, and also wine, yenot, shmanim, which is shemen oil, and all this they had in the sukkah. So when I read this Baraita, I have a problem that Rashi helps me solve. How did they put wine and oil in their sukkah? Says Rashi, ינות ושמנים, נותנים בכוסות של זכוכית לנוי. They had special utensils made out of glass. They were transparent, so you could see the color of the wine and the color of the oil. And that's what they had inside their sukkah. So this Baraita says, all of this in the sukkah, once you put it up in the sukkah, you're not allowed to use this for the entire Chag. You cannot take some of the olive oil you put in the sukkah and make an egg. Why? Because you said this is to beautify the sukkah. You cannot touch the sukkah unless you take this wine or take this oil and say, I'm putting this in the sukkah, but if I want to use it, I can. So that's what the Baraita says. And I love this Baraita because I love this description of beautiful Sukkot in the time of the Tanaim. And I like this Baraita so much that I actually made my own Noi. I wrote this Baraita and beautified it, and I have it in my Sukkah because I think it's lovely. Okay, so as I said, lovely Baraita. What is it doing here in the Sugya? As we said before, the Gemara stated, Rav Chisda said, you have absolutely no problem to put a cloth if it makes the sukkah beautiful. And maybe this is also what's written in the Baraita, because the Baraita describes that their sukkah were full of all kinds of good and beautiful things, including cloth. So maybe this Baraita shows us that Rav Chisda is right. And it's not only a memra of an Amara, it's also already written in the Mishnayot. Says the Gemara, no. This is not a proof that Rav Chisda is according to the Baraita. Why? Maybe the Baraita is talking about putting all these beautiful things in the sukkah, but on the sides. לדפנות כאמר, אבל למעלה, אי מלאך אפילו לנאותה, נמי סכך מקבל טומאה קר אליהם. Says Rashi, maybe the Tanaim thought that you can put all of this in the sukkah, but only on the side. Maybe they think that if you put it below the schach, it's a problem. So I'm summing up the sugya. The Mishnah sounded as saying you cannot put anything below the schach. Comes Rav Chisda and says, no, you want to beautify your sukkah, put whatever you want below the schach. That's fine. The only problem is if you're putting it there so leaves will not fall on you. And we said, oh, that's hard to understand because leaves falling is also problematic aesthetically. So what's the idea behind Rav Chisda? We put that aside and we continued, and we saw that the Gemara asked, maybe this Baraita is helping Rav Chisda, and it answers no, this Baraita is not helping Rav Chisda, but you should all know that Rav Chisda remains lehalacha. This is not saying that Rav Chisda is not right. It's only saying that Rav Chisda is not already written in the Baraita. Up till now, we went through the Gemara and we did the Gimel, right? We're learning Gemara, Perush, Rashi, and Tosot. So we did Gemara and we did Perush. But we had a question on Perush Rashi. We had a question. And our question is not only ours. The Mordechai, which is a Rishon in Ashkenaz, also asked the same question on Rashi. So let's use him in order to understand Shitat Rashi in the Sugya. Says the Mordechai the following. לא שנו אלא מפני הנשר, פירש רש"י שלא יפלו העלים על השולחן ויטנפו המאכל. ולפיכך, אין לנו טעם נכון לחלק בנשר לנאותה. Ask the Mordechai, I don't understand. Rashi explained that the problem with this is because it's helping us eating clean food, so we won't have things falling inside our soup. But if that's the case, says the Mordechai, what's the difference between that and making the sukkah beautiful? That's also making the sukkah beautiful. I do not understand. Continues the Mordechai and gives an answer. The answer was given by Rabbeinu Peretz. ומורי הרב רבנו פרץ ז"ל חילק. נהי צורך האדם הוא מפני הנשר, אבל לנאותה הווי צורך סוכה ובטל לגבי סוכה. Boom. Rabbeinu Peretz is doing philosophy. What is Rabbeinu Peretz saying? Rabbeinu Peretz is saying, if something is aesthetic, if we consider it an aesthetic object, it cannot be something that is useful at the same time. Aesthetics is something that people don't use. It's something that people enjoy, but they do not use. Hai tzorech adam hu. If I put this piece of clothing to keep the leaves from falling into my soup, this clothing is not aesthetics. This cloth is a kli for me. It's for my usage. It's using itself in order to prevent the leaves from falling. So Rabbeinu Peretz says if something is useful, it cannot be Aesthetics. This is really something that was discussed in art. There was a whole movement that said art can only be something that is not useful. And on the other hand, we had a movement that said, no, art can be also useful. And this is really a big philosophical discussion in art itself. So Rabbeinu Peretz says, I think that if something is art, it cannot be useful. So only if something is not useful, then it's kasher. That's what Chisda said. But if something is useful, then it's already pasul because it's not noi anymore. If you're using it, then it's not noi. That's what Rabbeinu Peretz says, and that's how he explains the Shita of Rashi. Okay, so now we understand Rashi. Let's see Tosfot, and we'll see that Tosfot does not agree and does not understand and thinks something totally different. So Tosfot Dibur Matchil Peres begins with a tshuva that he gives us from the Geonim. This happens a lot of times in the Tosfot. Tosfot is quoting someone else and not only Rashi. So Tosfot says, Katuv בתשובת הגאונים, עד קטן פירס עליה סדין מפני החמה או תחתיה מפני הנשר פסולה, היכא דחמתה מרובה מצילתה בלא סדין. אבל אם יש צילתה מרובה מחמתה כשרה, ואין הסדין פוסלתה. Says the Tosfot, the only problem I have with putting something below the sukkah, also if it's something to prevent leaves, is only if the sukkah itself is not kosher on its own. The sukkah has to be tzilata meruba mechamata, more shade than sun. So when I start with sukkot and I put all kinds of leaves on the top of my sukkah, first I have a lot of shade. But what might happen? The sun and the wind and the pieces of the schach fall, and a few days later, the same schach is not kasher anymore because it became dry, and now I have more sun than shade. Says the Geonim, if Yael, you will put a piece of cloth, then the sukkah will be problematic. But if you put this piece of cloth, well, the sukkah is still good, that's no problem. So Rabbeinu Tam uses this and says, what the Geonim said is not only when the sukkah is kosher now and later will be pasul. Already now the sukkah will be pasul if I put a piece of cloth below it. Okay, so let's repeat what the Tosfot says. And why does the Tosfot say this? Tosfot disagrees with Rashi because of the same question we just asked. How can it be that if something is useful, it's not noi? Tosfot does not accept this. Tosfot thinks that noi is still noi, art is still art, aesthetics is still aesthetics, even if it's useful. So if something is useful, it doesn't mean that it's not aesthetic. It will still be kasher. The only problem I have with this piece of cloth is if the sukkah itself is pasul, like what the Geonim said. So that's why Tosfot explains, why do I have a problem with a cloth that's helping me from preventing from the leaves falling? Because if the leaves have fallen and the schach itself is not kasher anymore, the fact that I have a piece of cloth holding these pieces doesn't make it kasher. That's why it's pasul. Let's read the Mordechai explaining Rabbeinu Tam, and it will help us understand what Rabbeinu Tam said and a big chiddush that he has in his statements. So the Mordechai, who explained us Rashi before, continues and explains us Rabbeinu Tam. Uparesh Rabbeinu Tam, veri v'chen b'tshuvat hagaon. So we have Geonim, we have we have Rabbeinu Tam. מפני הנשר שלא ינשרו, ובכך תהיה חמתה מרובה מצילתה. The Geonim says, the only problem I have with this piece of cloth is because this piece of cloth is telling me that the schach itself is problematic. The problem is in the schach, the problem is not in the cloth. If the cloth is there, even if it helps me eat my soup cleanly, that's fine, because noi is fine. The only problem is if there's a real problem in the schach. So what's the chiddush in what Rabbeinu Tam is saying? Let's continue with the Mordechai. The Mordechai says, וכיוון דלדעת כך עושה, דעתו שאם ינשרו סדין מחזיקן ונמצא דבר המקבל טומאה מחזיק העלין התלושין, לכך פסולה עתה מיד, אבל אינה אותה כשרה. This is a very big chiddush. Very big chiddush in Rabbeinu Tam that the Mordechai helps us understand. Because what did Rabbeinu Tam say? If the schach is pasul, then we have a problem with the piece of cloth. Okay, great. but that's always pasul. The sukkah with a bad schach is not a kosher sukkah. Says the Mordechai, Rabbeinu Tam doesn't mean that when you put the piece of cloth, the schach is already pasul. When I put this piece of cloth, it's when the schach is 100%. I know that in 3 days I will have a problem. So says Rabbeinu Tam, because Yael, you are thinking that in the future, this will help you keep the schach. Already now, the sukkah is possible, even though now there's absolutely no problem. But because your whole idea is to put this piece of cloth to solve a problem that is not yet in existence, that already shows us that this is a problematic piece of cloth. It's not there to be aesthetics. It's there to try to solve a halachic problem in a problematic way. So it's already pasul. So what do we have here? We have a very interesting machloket between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, with a few places that they're in machloket, a few nekudot b'machloket. The first nekuda b'machloket is that Rashi thinks that not everything is aesthetic, even though it's there to help me be clean and beautiful. It's not always aesthetics. Rashi says, if I'm enjoying it as a person, it's useful. It's not noi. Only noi is kasher. If it's not noi, it's pasul. And Tosfot and Geonim say, no. Even if it's useful, it's fine. The problem is when something else is happening. So that's the first machloket. And we made it even more specific. Rashi thinks that aesthetics is only something that is not useful. And Tosfot and Geonim say, listen, also something useful is also aesthetics and it's kasher. So that is the big machloket between Rashi and Tosfot when it comes to aesthetics in the sugya. The last part that we saw an interesting machloket between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam is that Rashi is looking to find a problem now. The sukkah is pesula because now you did something problematic. But Tosfot is allowing himself to say something very radical. Now everything is fine. But the sukkah is pasul now because of a problem that will arise in the future. So I'm summing up again. According to Rashi, noi is only something that is useful for the sukkah and not if it's useful for a man. If it's useful, that's already not noi. And the Geonim and Tosfot say no, even if something is useful, it's still noi, and that's why everything is good, everything is kasher. You can put a piece of clothing below the schach, even if it helps you from eating soup without leaves, that's fine. According to Rashi, aesthetics is very narrow. According to Tosfot, aesthetics is much, much larger. And the last point is that only if now there's a problem, then we'll say that it's a problem according to Rashi. And according to Tosfot, even if the problem will only arise in the future, it's already problematic now. So that's another part, the machloket between Rashi and Tosfot. So I'm summing up. We saw an interesting machloket. I really like it because I like it when there's philosophy inside the Gemara, which happens a lot. And the first part was whether or not I'm looking at things that beautify my space as things that are fine, which are not pasul, and what keeps them that way, according to Rashi, only if they're not useful. If they're useful, it's not noi anymore, and Tosfot is cholik. Another machloket is Rashi says, if there's a problem, it has to be now. And according to Tosfot, even a problem that will only arise later on, since I'm taking it into consideration already now, it will be pasul already in this moment. So we started Masechet Sukkah. I'm very happy you joined us to learn Gemara, Rashi, and Tosfot. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll meet again next week, learning another Rashi and Tosfot, and taking our limud of Daf Yomi a little step further. Litraot.